Today, I was thinking of just doing a loosely structured video recommending 7 books in the broad category of historical fiction. So what is this loose structure I have chosen? Well, as the subject relates to history, I will be listing my recommendations in roughly chronological order of when they are set. There is an exception to this rule, an outlier that is not so easily placed in a particular historical time period, perhaps I should say in a singular historical time period, so I'll be saving that recommendation for last, even if it technically begins somewhere between the first and the second on the list. Anyways, historical fiction has always been a great love of my reading life. I like history, I'm interested in heritage. It brings me pleasure, satisfaction, inspiration to see the kaleidoscope of human experience through the ages. People overcoming, or at least surviving through, times of turmoil. People striving for what they believe in. People living. In historical fiction, you get all this. You can learn a little piece of history. You can get immersed in a different time and place, all while being told a story. So let's begin at the origins of the human story, or at least as early as storytellers tend to go, with a tale of life set in the Upper Paleolithic. I first came across Björn Kurtén while researching the Ice Age. I, like I'm sure all of you at home, went through a 6-month period in my mid-20s, fascinated by cave art and researching the development of, how should I term this? Development of recognisable human consciousness evidenced by the art that these people living between roughly 50,000 and 12,000 years ago left behind. You can see the little library besides me here that I collected on the subject of life in the Upper Paleolithic during those months. A topic I wanted to learn more about, though, was not a human one. It was the life of the cave bear, that lumbering extinct species of bear whose skulls and skeletons, as well as the claw scratches they left on the rock walls of their cave dwellings, are all that remain of their presence beside a few representations in art from Upper Paleolithic humans. Wanting to learn more about cave bears, therefore, I stumbled upon Björn Kurtén's book on the subject, one of the few and the most authoritative books dedicated to cave bears. You'd think there'd be more books about them, really, but really, no, not that many. In any case, I found Kurtén's writing immensely readable for a topic that I think it's fair to say is ever so slightly on the niche side of non-fiction literature. From that book, I became aware that Kurtén was a Finnish paleontologist and had been a professor at the University of Helsinki. And, aside from academic papers and non-fiction, he had strayed into the realms of fiction also. This is how I found Dance of the Tiger, a novel of the Ice Age by Björn Kurtén, first published in 1978, with an English translation in 1980. What makes this book work as an exercise in narrativizing life back then is how Kurtén used his academic knowledge and shaped it into a compelling story. It is not something that happened, of course, but it has a plausible, well-researched believability that brings out details to create an authentic backdrop for the otherwise fictional happenings. In fact, the book opens with what is titled a challenge to the reader, where he lays out his driving theme when approaching this work of fiction. Then why did Neanderthal man, who had evolved and lived in Europe for perhaps 500,000 years, actually the first evidence of man in Europe, at Chilhac in France, dates back 1,800,000 years, vanish so quickly, in perhaps as little as a few thousand years? The main theme in Dance of the Tiger is a model that could account for this disappearance. One among many possible models, as it can be neither proved nor disproved at present, it does not attain the dignity of a theory, nor even the slightly shakier status of a hypothesis, but remains simply a model. It is not science, you may call it paleofiction if you like, and I challenge you to discover the model, which is a combination of 3 different factors. Taken together, they would ensure the speedy extinction of Neanderthal man, even in the most peaceful coexistence. Like every honest detective story, this one is full of clues, and some red herrings. You can reach the answer from them. So, go ahead, puzzle it out. I'll return to it at the end of the book. With this in mind, I think the revenge narrative structure, the straight line and clear motivation that revenge stories have, was perfect. Kurtén clearly understood that bringing and keeping his readers in the Ice Age, when they've already decided to pick up a fiction book on the topic rather than a non-fiction book, meant that it needed a compelling narrative foundation. And revenge, well, a wrong has been committed, and as a reader, I want it righted again. Our protagonist, Tiger, is the son of the chief of a peaceful tribe of Cro-Magnon man living in the endless icy snowscape of northern Europe around 35,000 years ago. His tribe is soon set upon by another tribe led by the bloodthirsty Shelk, a half Neanderthal, half Cro-Magnon crossbreed. With his father and most of his tribe dead, he eventually finds himself recuperating thanks to a tribe of Neanderthals who live out on a distant island to the far north, a small pocket of survivors of an otherwise dwindling race. What Tiger discovers, and what Kurtén really brings to life beautifully, is how Neanderthals are not the cognitively inferior brutes that some believe them to be, but are complex peoples in their own right, with their own culture and beliefs. I won't go too much into the story other than this, but Tiger finds a new home amongst these Neanderthals, and also love, and is able to pursue his vendetta to a satisfying end. When it comes to my opinion of the overall book, I really appreciate the way Kurtén weaves his knowledge of the Ice Age landscape, with its mammoths and its saber-toothed tigers, together in a way that brings out the sublime majesty of nature, in a way that, well, us modern readers often lose sight of that, the majesty of nature. Another point related to this is that in this story, Kurtén points out that Tiger is able to meet with different kinds of humans. Today, there is only us, Homo sapiens, that most humble of species that, through the origins of the term Homo sapiens, essentially means we've named ourselves man the wise, and even go a step further by subcategorizing modern humans, I believe, as Homo sapiens sapiens, which seems a step too far. I am a wise, wise man. I'm getting a little off topic now. We are talking about historical fiction, not the Latin etymology of our species. Whatever the case, Kurtén has written more than just an academically motivated model of one possible scenario for Neanderthals' extinction. Dance of the Tiger is a thrilling yarn in its own right, and as with any historical fiction, and as any historical fiction should, it satisfies both on the level of experiencing and learning a little about the distant past, and in following characters and a narrative from beginning to end. There is a sequel called Single Tusk, but I've not read that, so I can't give any comments. One last thing about Dance of the Tiger, though. I adore its cover. The art evokes the Ice Age, with a mammoth in profile, its trunk framing a saber-toothed tiger ready to pounce. And from this image of a fearsome creature concealing itself ready to pounce, Let's jump forward around 33,000 years to a rather more cowardly critter hiding due to fear, who, nonetheless, attains the status almost of a god. How often do you think about the Roman Empire? Well, I can tell you of one gentleman who probably wished he didn't have to think about the Roman Empire quite so often, and this was the Emperor Claudius. I, Claudius is a fictional autobiography by Robert Graves following the early life of that emperor, and it often finds itself on a fair few lists of classics in the realms of historical fiction, and particularly Roman historical fiction. And it is clear why. To give you a sense of what it is about, I don't think I can do much better than reading its first paragraph. And from there you can decide whether or not this narrative will interest you. I, Tiberius Claudius Drusus Nero Germanicus, this, that, and the other, for I shall not trouble you yet with all my titles, who was once, and not so long ago either, known to my friends and relatives and associates as Claudius the Idiot, or that Claudius, or Claudius the Stammerer, or Claudius, or at best as poor Uncle Claudius, am now about to write this strange history of my life, starting from my earliest childhood, and continuing year by year until I reached the fateful point of change, where some 8 years ago, at the age of 41, I suddenly found myself caught in what I may call the golden predicament, from which I have never since become disentangled. So, as you can gather from this, I, Claudius, is told in the first-person perspective from Claudius, him thinking back on his life under the tyrannical absolutism of Augustus, Rome's first emperor, then his witnessing of the increasing aging depravity of Tiberius, which then fell even further into wickedness, if you can believe, in the reign of Caligula. Throughout all this turmoil, however, Claudius is essentially such a bumbling nothing amongst the imperial family that despite so much betrayal and schemes and being schemed against, no one really would think to bump Claudius off because, well, what would be the point? This essentially makes Claudius a perfect character to follow, to witness the ins and outs of the early Imperial Roman period, with the twist at the end being that Claudius, as the first paragraph suggests, and a little knowledge of history would have you know, it ends with Claudius actually becoming emperor himself. Now, how does he manage this? Well, the Praetorian Guard essentially thought him such a feckless and controllable fool that they pledged their loyalty to him to ensure the continuation of the Augustan line after they had assassinated Caligula. So Claudius essentially became emperor because he was nearby and he could serve as a continuity figure for the imperial family. There is a follow-up book titled Claudius the God, which deals more with Claudius's life as emperor. What Claudius gets across, though, is the crushing fear of life in the Roman court. And you often get the sense, or at least I do, that poor old Claudius would have preferred a quiet, scholarly life somewhere away from it all. If you find yourself thinking about the Roman Empire quite often, then I really would suggest I, Claudius. It's not just a book to have ticked off a must-read of great historical fiction literature. It is a insightful, sometimes tragic, sometimes darkly humorous glimpse into Roman imperial life and into the imagination and writing of Robert Graves. I found myself voraciously reading through voraciously. Sorry, I was not reading vivaciously, that would be very different. Voraciously is what I meant. It's great when you start on the topic of Genghis Khan and you've got a big smile on your face. I found myself ferociously reading through Conn Iggulden's Conqueror series at some point during my first year of uni. The 5-book series chart out the life of Genghis Khan and the creation of the Mongolian Empire, with the final 2 books dealing with his descendants. Let's just focus on the first book now though, Wolf of the Plains. There is no great Khan here, just Temujin, who is the second son of the Khan of the Wolf tribe of Mongolian nomad horsemen. Now, when his father dies, the first son inherits the position of Khan, and fearing that the previous Khan's other children may cause trouble in the future, he banishes Temujin, leaving him to starve when he was only still a child. From these harsh beginnings, Temujin first survives, becomes strong, grows up, and finds companions, and this eventually leads to him himself becoming Khan. But this is not just a story of Mongolian nomad horsemen, no. The action really heats up with the arrival of the Tartar invaders, who kidnap Temujin's wife Bort, and he has to rescue from their clutches. From here, with his position secure, he can, in the later novels, begin to consolidate the Mongolian tribes and spread his empire. I remember this book and all the books in the series being full of thrilling action, and I admired how the author fleshed out the period and particularly life on the Mongolian plains. As you can see from these editions, they're all pristine and new. These aren't the ones I originally read all those years ago. I bought these last year because I'm planning a reread in the not too distant future, perhaps during some long afternoons in the shade in the summer months. Taiko is a truly sweeping, era-spanning Japanese historical epic, as you can probably tell from the size of the fella, and this is the abridged English translated version, so I wonder how long Eiji Yoshikawa's original serialized Japanese version was when it was first released. It should probably be noted that out of Yoshikawa's historical fictions, his work Musashi, which I have on the shelf up here, following the life of renowned samurai Miyamoto Musashi, is probably the best known, but I wanted to suggest Taiko, as it was the first of Yoshikawa's books that I read, and I was truly struck by it. Set at the close of the 16th century, at a time of great upheaval and instability in Japan, with warlords vying for power, its semi-biographical story follows Toyotomi Hideyoshi, known slightly mockingly as Monkey due to his hairiness and diminutive size, and it follows him as he eventually becomes one of the 3 great unifiers of Japan. Now, forgive some of the pronunciation here, but alongside Hideyoshi was the ambitious and brutal Oda Nobunaga and the wise and calculating Tokugawa Ieyasu. Now, despite Hideyoshi's humble beginnings, his wit, survival instinct, and ability to respond to circumstances eventually lead him to be bestowed with the title of, well, Taiko, and this gives him essentially the power of a regent making decisions for the emperor. It has been 5 or 6 years since I actually read Taiko, but what sticks in my mind is the weather, how very British of me. What I mean by this is the way that Yoshikawa brings the landscape to life, how you really get a sense of the changing seasons as the various battles take place and the various military campaigns move forward. I'd like to finish my recommendation of Taiko with a final suggestion, if you do decide to pick it up. The way I read the works of Yoshikawa were first with Taiko, then Musashi, and I closed it off with his memoir, which is in English titled Fragments of a Past, and this follows the first 20 years of his life, from 1892, born into the household of a impoverished former samurai, and then the first, as I said, 2 decades until he becomes an author. By reading these books as an informal trilogy, you can travel through Japanese history from the end of the Sengoku period all the way to the birth of modern Japan. And in contrast to his epic fictions, Yoshikawa's autobiography is much more scaled back and domestic in scope. So it's a nice way to round off a reading journey. For this next recommendation, I must include the important caveat that I haven't actually finished reading it yet, and I'm sure you'll agree, but the ending of a book can really reframe your overall opinion of it, so as such I can only give a tentative recommendation. Nonetheless, I would like to recommend this at this current stage. The Witches of Vardo is set in 1660s Finnmark at the northernmost tip of Norway. This region of Norway is known for its history of witch trials, and the women we follow, both of them, their lives have been affected by accusations of witchcraft. Inborg is seeking to rescue her widowed mother who's been accused of being a witch, and the other character we follow is Anna, a formerly wealthy merchant from the south of Norway who seems, well, somewhat entitled as a character, and she had been a former mistress of the King of Denmark, but has now been packed off and imprisoned in the fortress of Vardo to, well, get her out of the way. It is through Inborg and Anna's perspectives that we follow the story. It also weaves in elements of folklore and of the culture of the Sami people who inhabit the region. I was drawn to this book because of its setting, Vardo, which I visited when on a road trip with a friend up to Finnmark some years ago. My friend and I just stumbled upon the Witches' Memorial, not planning to go there that morning. We had been looking for the Fortress of Vardo, and after wandering through that, found a perpetually burning chair that memorialises the 77 women and 14 men who were burned in the witch trials of the 1620s. Anyways, I offer a tentative recommendation of The Witches of Vardo for its sense of atmosphere and mystery. I look forward to seeing where it goes. But as it's only tentative, I will offer an alternative recommendation, and that would be to, well, think of doing what I did, and thinking of a place you visited, or a place you wish to visit, one that's particularly meaningful to you, and trying to see if there's a historical fiction set there. In my experience, knowledge of history and stories add layers to a place, either when you're there or merely your perception of a place far away. This is where it begins, sort of. The story of Richard Sharpe, who would later lead a squad of riflemen to fight in many skirmishes and many battles against the French forces in the Napoleonic Wars. He is an icon of military historical fiction, with around 24 books bearing his name, Sharpe, and all written marvellously by Björn Cornwell. I was first introduced to the character of Sharpe through the ITV TV series starring Sean Bean. My mother was a big fan of the series when I was growing up, so they were always a favourite to stick on in the household, each episode being based on one novel and essentially feature length, so they're perfect for a drizzly winter afternoon. Sharpe's Tiger by Bernard Cornwell was the first Sharpe book that I read, and chronologically it is the first book in the series, but not the first book published. It serves as part one of the India trilogy, taking place during the dramatic Siege of Seringapatam in 1799, and leads up to the defeat of Tipu Sultan by the British, or more specifically the British East India Company during the Fourth Anglo-Mysore War. It is not just the start of Sharpe's story, but also establishes one of his most infamous foes, Sergeant Obadiah Hakeswell, a vile villain who was hanged when he was younger for assaulting a parson's daughter, but managed to survive the hanging and has since become obsessed with the idea that he is invulnerable, and this gives him the excuse, and his kind of religious reverence and his reverence for his mother give him the excuse to abuse all the troops under his command and anyone he comes across. In Sharpe's Tiger, his lust for women, for instance, and particularly the woman at Private Sharpe's side, a half-caste widow, leads Hakeswell to provoke Sharpe into striking him in front of witnesses. And as Hakeswell is the superior officer, he is thereby able to court-martial Sharpe, putting him through a particularly grueling 200 lashes or so out of an intended 2,000, essentially a death sentence, before Arthur Wellesley, the British officer who would later defeat Napoleon at Waterloo, steps in to halt the punishment. Wellesley then sets Sharpe on a secret task to rescue a senior officer being held by Tipu Sultan, and it is from this mission that the adventure unfolds. What I remember most from this book, and the India trilogy more generally, was the heat, the sweat, and the smell of gunpowder. This book, Sharpe's Tiger, is also much more claustrophobic than many of the other Sharpe books that I've read. I originally read this paperback version of Sharpe's Tiger, but when the Folio Society announced they were bringing out a few Sharpe editions, I jumped on the chance to get them on my shelves. They have this stunning scarlet cover worthy of a redcoat officer. I like how they have the dates when the novels are set on the side as well. And the woodcut engravings inside are wonderful. I hope the Folio Society one day continue the Sharpe series, although I wonder if they'll change the cloth cover from red to green once Sharpe ends up leading the Rifles. In any case, I have all the Sharpe books that have been published thus far on a shelf elsewhere, and I still have a ways to go, which I'm rather glad of, because this gives me something to look forward to. But for today, my recommendation is Sharpe's Tiger, the perfect place to start with the Sharpe novels, as it is still, chronologically, assuming Bernard Cornwell doesn't add another, chronologically, the first adventure. At the start of this video, I mentioned that the final book I would recommend would be one that's not so easily placed in historical chronology, and hinted that it was a multi-era spanning novel. Perhaps some of you, who are familiar with historical fiction, were expecting me, therefore, to suggest Edward Rutherford novel, such as Sarum or Forest. But no, not today, my reason being simple, and that's I haven't actually got round to reading any of them yet. I've got both Sarum and Forest up there, but maybe a little later. Instead, let me introduce Alan Moore's The Voice of the Fire. You may recognise the name Alan Moore, known for his visionary, era-defining stories in the comic book medium, with stories such as Watchmen, From Hell, V for Vendetta. But more recently, he has transitioned from comics to prose works, such as his short story anthology Illuminations, and his London-set fantasy series of books, beginning with The Great Wen. The Voice of the Fire, though, in this respect, is notable, as it marked his prose debut. It is an anthology of short stories spanning nearly 6,000 years, all based around Alan Moore's hometown of Northampton. Beginning with its first story, Hobbs Hogg, Alan Moore has admitted that this chapter, in his prose debut, essentially offered a level of literary difficulty that might be challenging for the general reader. It's just this chapter that's written in this way, but, well, it is a striking first-person voice. The setting is 4000 BC, and, well, let's just read out the first line. A hind of hill, ways off to sunset down, is sky come, like as fire, and walk I up in way of this, all hard of breath, where is grass colding on ice feet, and wetting they. To be honest, when I first read this sentence, I just assumed that in my brain I'd had some sort of temporary muddling of my reading comprehension. So I read it again, and it did not change. These were the words, and this was the correct order, and it was what Alan Moore intended. Despite all this, I will say that, at least for me, I got used to how he wrote this first chapter very quickly, and the general meaning of it is very easy to understand, and once you get into the flow of it, then even if you do occasionally trip up, it is not difficult to understand what's going on, certainly not as difficult as it may first seem. The reason I bring this up is simply to say, don't let this first story put you off Voice of the Fire, just because it will be challenging as a reader, although some of you may well appreciate the challenge. From this story onwards, you go to In the Drownings, with the character traversing the wetlands on kind of strange stilts. And In the Drownings is the one that particularly stays with me for its eeriness. Another eerie tale in here is Confessions of a Mask, which is interesting because it relates to the gunpowder plot, which I have a great interest in, and it's from the perspective of a decapitated head. The last story takes place in 1995, so it is essentially up to the modern day. If you want a book with a distinct sense of place and a tour through a highly localised English history, like a Rutherford book with a touch of added unsettling eeriness, then Moore's Voice of the Fire is a worthy addition to your reading list. The paperback I first read was this one, accompanied by photographic artworks, but the cover of this 25th anniversary edition is just so colourful and vibrant and evocative that I just had to get it on my shelves. Well, from the northern Europe of the Ice Age to a tumultuous era in Japan to the Northampton of 1995, those were 7 historical fiction recommendations. Dance of the Tiger, I, Claudius, Wolf of the Plains, The Witches of Vardo, Taiko, Sharpe's Tiger, and Voice of the Fire. Out of my recommendations, was there one in particular that caught your interest? Have you read any of them? If so, what are your thoughts? And are there any historical fiction books you would like to recommend? Please do feel free to discuss all this down in the comments. Thank you for spending a little time with me here on Phantasoscope, flicking through some historical fiction recommendations and the historical fiction books that I've found most memorable over the years. If you've enjoyed this video, please do consider leaving a like, and if you want to see more of this kind of thing, please do subscribe if you feel so inclined. I wanted to offer these recommendations following my recent old-timey book review, where I looked at an anthology of 12 short stories, Saga of the Sword by F. Britton Austin, which similarly spanned multiple epochs. Just like Dance of the Tiger, in fact, it begins in prehistory, although I think Dance of the Tiger is still set around 20,000 years earlier than the first story in Austin's collection. Following that old-timey book review and this flicking through, I will be making another reeling off video where I will reel off a few historical film recommendations, epics in particular, so that's what's coming next on the channel, before I move on to, well, some future projects. We'll see. In any case, I'll be back here on Phantasoscope soon. Speak to you then.